John Berger needs very little introduction, but I think I'd like to refresh our memories just a little. He has written art criticism, brought together in the collections Permanent Red, The Look of Things, About Looking, as well as a controversial study of Picasso and of Nesvestny, the Russian sculptor and Russian art, called Art and Revolution. It would not be untrue, I think, to say that his art criticism, and particularly the television series and book Ways of Seeing, were instrumental in shaping a generation's view of art history and the images which surround us. Indeed, they crystallized a new way of seeing, one informed by social and economic history, and which simultaneously managed to make us see images afresh through words, never an easy task, I think, as well as take into account the importance of the viewer, the whole nature of an image's reception. Then, to go through the various kinds of books John has written, there are, I think, what we could call the imaginative documentaries, A Fortunate Man, his study of a country doctor, which is at once that and an investigation of the place of medicine in our society, and A Seventh Man, his study of migrant labor. Both of these, I think, give evidence of the writer of fiction, fictional methods and perceptions, which of course find their home in Berger's novels. The brilliant book, one of my favorites, A Painter of Our Time, then The Foot of Clive, Corker's Freedom, and G, still one of the few radically innovative novels to have won the Booker Prize since that prize's inception. John, incidentally, gave half the prize money to the Black Panthers, the West Indies being where Booker money is on the whole made, and used the rest to undertake the research on A Seventh Man. I should also mention John Berger's very fruitful collaboration with the filmmaker Alain Tanner and the scripts he wrote for Salamander, The Middle of the World, and Jonah, who will be 25 in the year 2000. He has just completed another script now on the life of Isabelle Eberhardt, and perhaps he'll tell us a little about that. Since his move to the Haute-Savoie in France, John has produced, apart from television programs, and numerous articles and poems, which you may have read in various magazines, the book Pig Earth, the first volume of a trilogy, Into Their Labors. These are interlinked stories in which the writer is effectively a witness to life in a peasant community, a community which will soon constitute our past, our European history. Linked too to his life in the Haute-Savoie is another way of telling. Some of you, I think many of you will be familiar with that. And as you know, it's a book which is at once a theory of photography and an essay on its alternative uses. And now we have And Our Faces, My Heart, Briefest Photos, a rather extended title, which I'd like to ask you about a little later on. The book is effectively a meditation on time and space. It contains much excellent poetry, plus more that we'll talk about in a minute. And apart from And Our Faces, we also have the play, A Question of Geography. I've mentioned all these things as a list because I think the first thing I'd like to ask you, John, is why it is that in an epoch when most writers hesitate to stray across forms, to transgress boundaries, you felt free to defy these boundaries of category and genre.
I don't know, really. Perhaps it has something to do with my education. Because I ran away from school when I was 16, and after that I didn't have any formal education. And I was a sort of autodidact. I had lots of teachers, lots of men and women who taught me most of what I know. But always in a completely informal situation and never within any kind of educational institution. And perhaps it is to do with that, because it seems to me that, one of the things that formal education does, or formal higher education does, is to construct those very tight walls around categories. And once you've passed through that educational machine, maybe you're rather inhibited about moving from room to room through these walls. Maybe you can't even find the door. Whereas if you haven't been through that, well, you're always more or less in this strange situation in which we all are all the time. That is to say, there is the world all around and everything that is happening in it, and you find yourself in it, and your whole life is story of trying to come to terms with that, trying to come to terms with the fact that you are in it and that it exists. And given the enormous difficulty of that, perhaps any means is useful. And then if I answer that question more subjectively, I think that when I'm writing a story, fiction, or when I'm writing so-called reportage, or when I'm trying to write something closer to a biography, or even when I'm pursuing an idea in a theoretical essay, I don't actually feel any very, very different activity taking place somewhere in my body or in my head. This is always the same kind of struggle. That is to say that somewhere I think that I have not even understood, but that I have felt or perceived something, and I don't know what it is. I can recognize it if I see it, but it certainly doesn't exist in words. Maybe it exists a tiny bit like a musical motif, or like a visual hieroglyph. And then there is that endless, or seemingly endless struggle to find words which don't betray that, and which come closer and closer towards it. Anyway, that is how I see my own activity of writing. And that process, which I've just described, is not very different, whether I'm writing a story or whether I'm trying to explain why Constable didn't paint portraits.
But you did used to paint, and now you've told me that you've once again started drawing. Is that activity a substantially different one?
Oh, yes. Yes, I think, well, drawing, anyway, I think is a very different activity because when you're drawing, let's just say drawing in a very direct way, I mean drawing something which is in front of you, a head, a face, a landscape, a tree, you really do have a given. I mean, it is there, and you are questioning it with your eyes, you're interrogating it. I mean, drawing is a form of interrogation of appearances. But it is given. Whereas the terrible thing about writing normally is that there is no given. Okay, you're telling a story, but you can change the story. I mean, you are trying to describe how this man comes into this room, with exactly how. So it's him, and it's this room, and no other. But then actually, suddenly, the thought can arrive to you, but maybe what the hell is he doing in that room? Maybe he shouldn't be going in anyway. Maybe he should be going out, or maybe he shouldn't be in this room at all. Because in fact, there is a story to construct.
It's still an interrogation of appearances, though, isn't it?
Interrogation of appearances, yes, but except that, I mean, supposing you then decide that he is, let's say, very, very simple, he's going out of the room. The appearances are different. So, whereas when one is drawing something, it is there as a given. And that makes it a much less, I don't know. I don't want to really generalize. Actually, when I draw, I simply lose myself completely. I mean, I simply lose myself in that object which is in front of me. That's all. But when I'm writing, perhaps I lose myself for a little moment, sure. But then I step back and look at it, and then I'm myself being critical, asking myself, was that actually correct? And there's always this stepping forward and stepping back. Whereas, of course, that happens with drawing, but it happens long after. I mean, it happens, you know, you can draw for 2 or 3 hours and not do that.
John, can we talk a little bit about the new book, which is an intensely intimate book, and somehow I think its material is difficult to convey publicly. Also, because it hasn't yet come out, I know most of you haven't read it, and I hope when you ask John questions later on, you'll talk about other things as well, but I would like to spend a little time on it. In some ways, I think it's a distillation of many of your insights over the years, and a natural development of your concern with images, with history, with sexuality. It's also, to an extent, an indictment of our times, the way in which capitalism, for example, has uprooted individuals, forced them into the role of migrants, dispossessed them of home and of history. But given the general configuration, it's also, as I said before, very intimate, very personal. Is it in any way an autobiography?
The subject of time has, in fact, obsessed me for a very long while, for I suppose about 20 years. That is to say, how do we, or rather more, how do we experience time? What is time, and what is our experience of time? What is the relation between past, present, future? What is the relation between that which is perhaps outside time, and which is timeless, and that which is embedded in time and in history? What is the purpose of history? All those kinds of questions. And over the years, I read many, many books pursuing the thoughts of others on this subject. I filled up piles of notebooks with quotations, quotations from Heidegger, quotations from modern physicists, poetry by poets, etc., etc. And I was saying to myself, well, and one day I will write a book about time. I even wrote pages, huge pile. But I never did it like that. It was there waiting. And I thought of it perhaps as a book of really intellectual inquiry, along with all the hundreds of thousands of other books that have been written about this subject which is very difficult because in a certain sense what St. Augustine said remains absolutely true. When I don't think about time, I think I understand it. As soon as I begin to think about it, I don't. And that's a paraphrase, but it means more or less that. And then I wanted to write a book about love, which is really what that book's about. Because it seems to me that love confronts time and confronts death. And death and time are absolutely indissoluble for us. And so I then wrote this book, which is not at all the kind of book that I imagined, because as Lisa says, it's a very intimate book. It's a book which actually first took form in letters that I wrote to the person I love. Then, at the same time, Lisa asks me whether it is autobiographical. I mean, it is highly personal. But if it was autobiographical, I think, if its intention was to be autobiographical, it would really be a great have-on. Because, all the things that one wants to know about somebody's life are not there. All the really factual stories is not there. It's only alluded to. So I think if it was an autobiography, it would be a very dishonest book. And at the same time, I wanted to try to write a book which would correspond, perhaps, or speak to, address, not only my experience, but the experience of lots of other people. Perhaps in a way, without making any claims for the book, perhaps everybody has passed through experiences like what that book talks about, or is all the time doing so. I mean, if you take the word anonymous, I mean, in the way that one usually uses it, I mean, it really does have rather two ways of use, because one can say that somebody or something is anonymous, or one can talk about an anonymous crowd, or an anonymous building. And we know what that means. I mean, and it's very impersonal. I mean, in that sense, the word anonymous suggests something which is completely impersonal. And the other way that we use the word anonymous in the English language is when you have a text, perhaps a poem or a piece of music, and one doesn't know who it's by. And so it's simply anonymous at the end. But in fact, it is a very, very personal thing. And if it has survived, even without a name, it is because it speaks to lots of people's experience. Well, pretentious as it may sound, what I was trying to aim at in that book is that second sense of anonymous. So it is both very personal, but it isn't autobiographical in the ordinary sense.
Just to give us a sense of that anonymity, or as you call it, anonymity, and since most of you won't have read the book, would you like to read us perhaps a passage or a poem from it? The book has a great deal of John's poetry, which I don't believe has been published before in many places.
Well, I mean, I can read the very first few lines of the book, which explain the title. The title, And Our Faces, My Heart, Brief as Photos. That comes from this little poem. When I open my wallet to show my papers, pay money, or check the time of a train, I look at your face. The flower's pollen is older than the mountains. Aravis is young as mountains go. The flower's ovules will be seeding still when Aravis, then aged, is no more than a hill. The flower in the heart's wallet, the force of what lives us, outliving the mountain. And our faces, my heart, brief as photos. Another theme, because if one is talking about time, one is also talking about space. If one is talking about presence and absence, one is talking about time and space all the while. And another theme, if you wish, which is threaded through this book, is the theme of emigration, or the theme of displacement. When people are forced, more or less, like for one reason or another, for economic reasons, for political reasons, sometimes with a gun in the back, to leave the place where they were born, where they belonged, the place which was, when they were a child, the center of the world, and to go out to somewhere else, which perhaps will never again be the center of the world. Now, this experience of emigration seems to me to be perhaps the most significant and typical experience of our century. But if you use emigration in the very widest sense of the term, much wider sense than the Home Office. I mean, for example, the experience of the First World War, at least on the Western Front, where millions of soldiers were transported in face of exactly a no man's land. This is already touching this theme of enforced transportation. The history of the concentration camps, the history of the labor camps in the Soviet Union, the history of economic immigration from Africa, the enforced immigration of people in poor countries towards richer ones. The existence all over the world, especially the third world today, of the great perimeter of every city, which is shanty towns. It seems to me that this is one of the most typical experiences of our century, which, in a way, I tried to write about when we made that book, The Seventh Man. And it's a theme which comes also into this book. And, okay, if you like, I will read you just, if I can, yes, this is just, again, a very short, abrupt poem, because there is a series of 10 poems which are about emigration. And this is the third, which is called Leaving. That's to say, when you leave where you belong. Pain cannot endure long enough. Tracks vanish under snow, the white embrace of leaving. I have tried to write the truth on trains. Without an ear, the tongue takes fright, clings to a single word. The train is crossing a bridge. Black ice collects on each letter. Sava, my river. Sava is a river in Yugoslavia which goes down through Belgrade and joins the Danube.
John, I think although many of the themes in And Our Faces are ones that you've explored before, people who approach this book and who haven't followed your recent work carefully may find it rather surprising. You have a reputation, or your early reputation named you as a Marxist and a materialist, and yet in this book, and in Pig Earth as well, I think, you introduce another dimension, that of soul, and use the word, which is not a word which usually comes into the other kind of terminology. For example, in And Our Faces, you write, "In reality, we are always between two times, that of the body and that of consciousness. Hence the distinction made in all other cultures between body and soul. The soul is first and above all the locus of another time." You also say in the space section of the book that the visible produces faith in the reality of the invisible. Could you tell us a little bit more about these two kinds of time and space and this element of soul?
I don't quite know how labels are made and how they stick onto people. I mean, it's something to do with the media, and it happens, but I'm not quite sure exactly how it happens. Anyway, of course, it is perfectly true that ever since my first book came out, a book which was then withdrawn by the publishers because it was politically unacceptable.
A Painter of Our Time.
Yes. Ever since then, you know, when anyone ever mentions or at least prints my name, it is always preceded by John Berger, the Marxist, or Marxist John Berger, or Marxist art critic, or Marxist, etc., etc. In the most odd circumstances sometimes, but still. Now I've never contested that label, because I have always been extremely, or not always, but I mean since a quite young age, extremely influenced by Marxism. And even today, that has not changed, in the sense that if one wants to try to understand and explain the history of the world in which we are living, it seems to me that Marxism is an absolutely essential tool to understand that history. Where the struggles are, if one takes a world view today, what the fighting is about, seems to me more or less to correspond to that historical view of Marx. Therefore, for understanding what is the arena of history, Marxism still seems to me to be indispensable. But there is also what is outside that arena, or at least for me there is. What is outside the historical arena. That category which we call the timeless, that which is beyond or outside time. And there, Marxism has absolutely nothing to say. It is conceivably possible that because Marxism had nothing to say about that, at least at a theoretical level, there has never really been a Marxist ethic. Not to mention what has been done in the name of Marxism.
I've read quite a lot of your things, and I've always, I admire your work enormously, but it seems to lack humour. It's a great stumbling block, because I think humour is an incredible element within the continuity of human experience, and wherever there is a lack of humour. I'm not saying it necessarily suffers your work, but I would like to think that sometimes you will be humorous. I'm sure you're humorous already.
You must read the new stories.
Well, I think actually, I mean, I'll try to answer very honestly. I mean, I think in life I have quite a sense of humor. I'm quite jokey, and I make people laugh, and I like laughing very much indeed. And I think And I think that, well, I've always thought that, I mean, perhaps it's a novel of mine that has not been much read, but a novel called Corker's Freedom seems to me to be quite funny. And I think there's one scene there with the magic lantern slide which is hilarious. But perhaps I'm wrong. And then I think that in the films with Alan Tanner, I mean, there's plenty of humor. But maybe in a large body of my writing, there isn't. I would like there to be. Maybe partly because, I mean, I'm not being forcefully, I mean, this is really true. I mean, I find writing so difficult. I have no facility. Really, verbally, very little gift. And so I have to rewrite everything. Really, I mean, anything between 8 and 15 or 20 times. Really, like that. And this, of course, is rather counterproductive to humor, because it has to be an extremely good joke to endure the 20th or the 10th time. And it may be a bit to do with that.
What happened in your personal life that made you have such a change in writing? If that's not too personal a question. I'm sure that there must have been something more than just different style, I mean different subjects.
Everyone heard the question? Yeah, I mean, what is, yes?
Not quite.
Well, the question is, in a novel like G, I write in one kind of narrative style, and that, for example, in the next book of fiction that I wrote, which was Pig Earth, the book about peasants, I mean, the style is extremely different. And the question is, how did that change come about? Was it connected to a change in my personal life? And what is the reason for this difference of style? I mean, I don't think that, yes, of course it was to do with my personal life, in the sense, but not in the sense of something very, of my inner life. I mean, obviously, probably immensely connected with the fact that when I was writing Pig Earth, I had already been living for 4 or 5 years amongst peasants, which I hadn't done before. So my personal daily life was different. But I think the real reason was much more conscious than that. And I mean, I remember very well, because, okay, I wrote G, and, you know, you can judge it better than I, but I mean, I thought that when I'd finished G, that I was rather masterly. And, you know, I could do it. And I thought, well, thank God, you know, after so many years of effort. And now, all right, and then I had this idea a little later, not immediately, that I wanted to write fiction about peasants. And really, I thought, well, you know, this time it'll go better. Because, I mean, I've learned something. I have a kind of mastery. I mean, a mastery in the sense that a painter, after 20 years of painting, has a sort of mastery. In that sense, I mean it. And then I started writing. And it just didn't work. It didn't work because G is about the upper middle class, mostly, and even the aristocratic class across Europe. And the experience of such people and the way that they tell themselves and fit into that experience, I mean, is so different from the way of peasants that the style just wouldn't fit. It just wouldn't work. Instead of approaching the subject, it distanced you from the subject. And so I said to myself, okay, well, I mean, I see now, and I mean, I just must try to learn again to tell stories in a different way. I mean, if you want me to be a bit more precise about that, I mean, I can be. You see, more or less, I mean, in a narrative style, which is very frequently the sort of classical novel style, which is classically about the middle classes, you have a kind of, we have probably several voices, but they are fairly continuous voices of individuals, talking more or less, or acting about their hopes and their fears. But as it were, you have, in a novel, I mean, you have perhaps several points of focus, but each time you enter one of those, you as it were, you continue with it. There is a kind of flow of a personal life. But now, this is, I think, very much to do with the conditions of living of people like that, who have privacy, who have a certain mobility, who live, privacy, okay. Now, in a village, something very different happens. A village of peasants. Because, first of all, no one has any privacy. I mean, they have privacy in their bedroom and so on, but I mean, everyone knows about everyone's life. They see each other. And it's not quite like a village in England, because most villages in England have a kind of class structure which doesn't happen in peasant villages, or at least in many, the ones I'm thinking about. And in fact, so you have a quite different kind of voice, because you have a kind of multi-voice. I mean, at one moment, you are, let's say, talking about what is happening to Basil, and then the very next sentence in the same paragraph, it is possible to put in something which is what somebody would say about Basil, and then perhaps something completely objective about the weather and the light on the roofs of that moment. I mean, you have a kind of jump, because it is a collective voice. Now, this collective voice requires a completely different style from this kind of symphony, or chamber music, perhaps better, of individual voices which are essential to the different subject matter, to the middle-class subject matter, if you wish. And in fact, I think in Pig Earth, I mean, I only just, at the end of that book, began to arrive at a style which perhaps did some justice to those experiences. I mean, I think, and you can perhaps see in it that it's, you know, it's a long, long journey. And perhaps actually what I'm writing now is perhaps a little closer, because I really did have to learn again.
Just to finish up, might I contain that question and ask you a little bit about storytelling? I mean, you say, I think it's in Under Faces, that the storyteller is death's secretary. And storytelling has become something which has concerned you more and more, and indeed Pig Earth and the next volume, which is now, I think, complete. You do tell stories on the whole, which is a very different procedure from G, is it not? Could you say something about the role of storytelling?
Well, the funny thing about, I mean, why do I say that perhaps storytellers are death's secretary? But working for life, needless to say, not for him, exactly. Because, I mean, the thing about a story, I mean, any story, sort of stories that people tell, but live stories, is that, in fact, in a sense, the story nearly always begins with the end. I mean, because until you know the end, the story does not have form. And so, in a sense, you begin with the end. And of course, the most natural end of all is the person's death. And if you're going to tell the story of a life, therefore, in a sense, you begin with her or his death. This is perhaps, of course, a concept which comes, or not a concept, but a practice, which comes, again, from living in the country, where, you know, there is a funeral every week, and everybody knows the person who died. And so death is much more present. And then after the funeral, people go to the cafe, or the men, anyway, go to the cafe and they drink, and quite often get drunk. But I mean, at least at the beginning, they mostly tell stories about the man. They remember things about the man who has died. They tell stories about him. And that seems to me to be a very natural and very, 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 very old practice. And it's true also that several of the stories that I have written have actually been provoked, in a way, by one of those people, or the person, the principal person, dying. And because and why? Because in a sense, one wants, perhaps, to try to save that life. I mean, that's too grand. But to preserve something of its meaning, and that's why it has to have such a strong form, against the onrush and chaos of oblivion, to draw something from that life, which is, of course, exactly what the men do in the cafe as well, in their way. And to try to find the order, if you wish, but order in a very pure sense, which was in that life. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean the death. I mean, if I think of one of those stories, it was an old shepherd who was, on Saturday night he was drunk and he was knocked over by a car, which didn't even stop. Played the mouth organ. And he owned nothing. So his death was very accidental. But perhaps not so accidental. You know? I mean, in the sense that, you know, he was about 75, and when I knew that and I went to his funeral, I wanted to write something about him. Like you play music at a funeral for somebody, and that happens when you have a community of people living together.
Yes. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.